I too would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Gadigal people of the Great Eora Nation and pay tribute to their elders. I'm very honoured to be part of this presentation ceremony. I do understand how important it is in the annual life of your organisation. And I said today I'd talk about lifelong education, and then of course I totally regretted saying that because I then wondered what it actually meant. So I've broadened it out a bit, and I've decided to really just talk about my personal interpretation of lifelong education rather than Googling a whole lot of stuff that other people have written about it. So this is just my view of what lifelong education is after having a lifelong life. But recently I was driving back from Goulburn on Sunday, and I heard this wonderful program on the ABC. It's called The Minefield, and I don't even know who was on it because you can't see them when it's on radio. But they were discussing pretty much lifelong education, and it was they all had different ideas about what it was too. But one of the things that I did find really inspiring, so I sort of, at the next time I stopped for a coffee, I actually wrote it down. One of them referred to the Delphic Oracle, and the Delphic Oracle's motto, or whatever it was know thyself. And I thought, wow, that's really what I think lifelong education is about. So I'm just going to make a number of observations about educating people right through their lives. And most of what I'm talking about will be about women, simply because that's mostly what we're talking about when we're talking about lifelong education. Recently, I undertook an interview for the Workers' Education Association, another one of my favourite organisations, and it was about older people's education, and they were doing a interview with me, and suddenly I realised they weren't asking me for my views. They were interviewing me because I was an older person and they were wanting to know what I thought. So apart from feeling a little bit mortified, I actually stopped and thought, what does it mean to me? So I started to think, and then I thought, all the medical reports say that you've got to keep doing something with your brain every day, and they tell you to do crosswords, and I banned myself from doing crosswords a long time ago because I knew I'd spend all day, and so I just banned myself from things that I know I won't be able to stop myself doing. But they do want you to keep your mind busy. But the other thing they say is learn a language, and having tried to learn, hello and thank you in the language of all the countries I go to, I've realised I can't even do that. So try it in Korean. Try thank you in Korean. Can anyone actually say that? Something like kumsahamnida or, anyway. So I realised I couldn't learn new languages. So what did I do? 2 years ago, I enrolled in a summer school course at Cambridge University, and it was in art history because it was that part of my degree which I had absolutely adored, but which I started by, I was moving into doing a master's in politics at the time. I did my final year in fine arts, so I never really properly studied fine arts. So I thought, no, I'll go and do it. And you can imagine what the summer school at Cambridge, I just so imagined everything, and the one thing I got right was the absolutely shocking bed in the college. It had a sort of metal bit down the middle. It was terrible. Anyway, I did 2 courses. I did late 19th century French painting, and I did Matisse and Picasso. And then they give you a general course where the sort of expert in the field comes and talks to you about autism, or one did medieval sewerage. It was so interesting. So they just come and talk to you about their speciality, and I actually found that the most interesting. One did, conflict in the South China Sea. So I now know more about the South China Sea than anyone else I know. But so And I suddenly realised that this was really what education was about. I sat up the front and was teacher's pet and took copious notes, which I never did when I was at university. I realise now I can't remember much, but I can now recognise a Matisse when I see one, sort of thing. And I know what a flaneur is too. But just the process of doing it was so exciting for me. So when we engage in education for older Australians, what does it mean for them? And because they're not going to go out and be CEOs of companies, and they're not going to go out and probably not going to go out and cure cancer. I mean, my knowledge of Matisse and Picasso is great for me, but it's not going to really help others. But they might turn up here in organisations like this and contribute by organising scholarships for those who do go out and cure cancer. So we've got to see our participation in continuing education as being a contribution to everyone else's education too. And this issue of why educate older citizens was hugely important during the debate about the Dawkins reforms in the university and college sector in the late 80s. Now, I was a president of the union at that time, so I was very involved in the fights that went on about the introduction of HECS. And looking back, you can see that HECS is quite an egalitarian way of paying for, if you can't provide free tertiary education, then HECS is a way of going about it. In that, you don't pay money back until you're actually earning a certain amount of money. But the problem with HECS was that if you didn't ever end up earning that money over a certain amount, then you actually got your education for free. And I was teaching at Macquarie University at the time, which had the highest percentage of older age students of any university in Australia. And of course we had the highest percentage of women older age. In fact, almost all our older age students were women. They were the daughters of the middle class who had been refused education by their parents. My mum was one. Her misogynist old father had sent his boys off to university and his girls didn't get that. So mum, of course, went back to second chance education as soon as she, you know, in the 60s and 70s. But in the 80s it was huge that those older age women were coming back to university, and they were my very best students because they were, you know, they were bright and everything, but they were so motivated. You know, they went home and studied while the 18-year-old boys went off and went to parties and things. And it actually created quite a lot of tension at the university in that the younger boys quite resented the older women. So the idea that these women were coming back and getting their education and not paying for it was a bit of an issue. And we had to fight a bit of a rearguard action to say, no, that's actually a good thing. There is actually a plus for society in having older age women educated, even if they're not paying back their HECS. And I personally loved it, the fact that they were the ones getting the free education. Because, as I say, for so long they had been just cut out of education. After Whitlam abolishes university fees, you get women coming back in, but you get a further onrush of women during the Dawkins period. So that's when I really started to think about lifelong education being about the person rather than about what they can do for the economy. But we all know the arguments about, because you're about this, the argument that we use in the aid and development sector all the time, which is for every year that you keep young girls in education, you add 2% to your country's GDP, which is a huge economic change. But that's the argument we use all the time about when we're trying to convince people in Pakistan to let girls go to school. So we all know about the advantage to the economy of education, but But it's not really about the economy, it's about you. The joy that I got from learning about Matisse and Picasso is what it's about. And as I said, when I was interviewed by the WEA, I kept saying, once I realised it was about what's going on in I said, you've got to keep your brain working and make sure you know things, because if you don't know things, you become quite an uninteresting person. I don't know what to talk to people about if I can't talk about, oh, look what's happening to the Liberal Party, or even, oh, isn't it dreadful what happened to poor old Greg Inglis on the weekend, and you know, things like that. You've got to be able to communicate with other people about the society we're living in. And if you don't know what's going on around you, you're not engaged in your community. People say, oh, I don't follow politics. And I think, well, they've actually disengaged from the community that we're in. Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying you have to be sort of mad dog about it, but you do need to keep an interest and, you know, read the news each day. Because an engaged community is a really great community. And my lifelong learning now is huge. I have a regular spot on ABC television just before Insiders on a Sunday morning. I'm on about once a month. And I'm mostly paired with Kerry Chigorowski, which is great fun because sometimes we have shocking arguments and sometimes we totally agree on everything. But I've realised that I have to be really, really well educated for that program. And so the week before the time I'm on, I spend about 4 hours a day reading the various online newses, plus 2 print newspapers, plus it's great actually because that's my idea of bliss. You know, I drink coffee and read the newspaper, but I also take notes and try to keep it in the brain because, like most women, I totally over-prepare and I am so much better. Last time I did it was a couple of weeks ago, and it was just after the big debate about education funding. Or was it last week? Yeah, it was about education funding, and it was really, really complicated, and I'd at last got it right, and I'd rung up Tanya Plibersek's office and got their stats and everything. And then we never even got around to talking about it. And I kept saying, all that information for nothing, you know, it did, because it pops out of you, like swatting for an exam, it pops out of your brain as soon as you've left the television studio. So that, to me, that is my form of ongoing education. But I've also realised that now I know all that stuff in so much more detail than I used to. It all fits together. It makes the next bit of information you get so much easier to understand and know where it fits. And it's that whole thing about the more information you have, the more knowledge you have, the easier it is to add stuff. And when I talk to brain people, you know, neurologists and all that sort of thing, because at our age we're very interested in issues to do with the brain, there are different parts of your brain. And because I said to this guy who was a professor, I said, look, I have terrible trouble remembering what I did last week, but if I read something in the newspaper that I already know a bit about, it's as easy as anything. It just adds to the information. And he says, oh, they're totally different parts of your brain. The fact your useful information, the stuff that you can add to your present store of knowledge, is different to your memory about your own life. So that explained that. Finally, I want to make a plea about what we sometimes call second chance education. Am I going okay? Have I gone over? It's about education when you've sort of stuffed up along the way. And I know a lot about that because I want to talk about that huge issue of easing access to education at all levels and at all stages. Because we have a very poor model at the moment where your main access to especially university education, is via the HSC, or in my day it was the Leaving Certificate. And it's changing a bit, but not fast enough. And it was the be-all and end-all of your life, really. And one of my jobs when I was president was to get the report of the child deaths and the number of suicides during their HSC year was horrible. It was never talked about and it was never printed in the papers, but there would be 2 or 3 every year of kids. So that's the thing about something has to be done about the pressure about the HSC. But I needed a second chance education because I had been to a posh girls' school, private girls' school, and the maths teacher was having an affair and didn't actually teach us. I was doing 2 maths, because the bright girls had to do 2 maths whether you wanted to or not, sort of thing. And we all failed, both maths, so which basically meant you failed your leaving. So I found myself not being able to get into Sydney University, which is what I wanted to do. And I obviously couldn't go back to my school because I'd been head girl, and it would have been like hanging around as an ex-Prime Minister, really. But so I enrolled at Sydney TAFE, you know, which is now, really it's UTS now, but it was just the TAFE there. And I did the Leaving Certificate from TAFE. It was the best education I'd ever had. I had a fantastic ancient history teacher. I had a maths teacher who got me A's. And I suddenly realised that without this wonderful public institution, I might have, I don't know, gone off and not even gone to university. So, and years later, I was asked to give out the prizes at TAFE for the Certificate 4 course, and I got up and said, look, what you're doing now is exactly what I did at this institution. This is my alma mater. And they were really stoked that, in actual fact, you know, I'd done exactly what they were doing. So that's why I can't overstate the importance of our TAFE sector and how we have to continue to fight for the TAFE sector to continue to be strong, and it was world class, and now it hardly exists in some areas. I won't go on about that. And these days I talk at quite a few groups which, although not specifically for older people, the audiences are almost always made up of older women. And some of these groups are specifically about educating themselves, like WEA and University of the Third Age, and groups like yours, which aren't specifically about educating yourselves, but you are devoted to the idea of ongoing education. And these are the groups that are the most interesting to talk to. The more social groups, I've just decided now I actually don't have the time to keep talking to them, because they don't, when you say, oh, now questions, and of course they don't really have questions because they haven't actually been listening to you. So I was just talking to Josepha about that. I've actually decided that some of the groups I won't now try to talk to. Finally, I want to finish with a quick biography of a great friend of mine who died a few years ago, and I'm talking about Joan Bielski, who I understand has been part of the donation of awards along the way. And Joan is a great example of lifelong and second chance education, and was a great champion of women and girls all her life. Joan left school without gaining her leaving certificate, but her intellectual... Sorry? Oh. Joan left school without gaining her leaving certificate, but her intellect and leadership qualities were recognised. She worked in a newsprint factory and in clerical jobs till she joined the Air Force at 18, serving as a telegraphist in communications during the war. And assisted by the ex-service man's rehabilitation scheme after the war, my father, a lot of our parents actually were helped by that scheme. Joan completed her matriculation at Sydney Tech, my alma mater, and then enrolled in New England University College, graduating with majors in history and economics in 1949. And of course, Armidale University, when it was set up as a long-distance educator, educated a lot of our parents, because my mum sat down and did, while bringing up 4 children, did courses from University of New England in Armidale. She completed a Diploma of Education at Sydney University, and then she spent, apart from 23 years of her life as a teacher, she spent the next 50 years of her life fighting really hard for women and girls to have the chance to have the education that she ended up with. And so when I think about lifelong education, it's Joan Bielski who I think of. Thank you, everyone.